Welcome to Beekeeping Today podcast presented by Bee Culture. Beekeeping Today podcast is your source for beekeeping news, information, and entertainment. I'm Jeff Ott.
And I'm Kim Flatham.
Hey, Jeff and Kim. Today's sponsor is Global Patties. They're a family-operated business that manufactures protein supplement patties for honeybees. It's a good time to think about honeybee nutrition. Feeding your hives protein supplement patties will ensure that they produce strong and healthy colonies by increasing brood production and overall honey flow. Now is a great time to consider what type of patty is right for your area and your honeybees. Global offers a variety of standard patties as well as custom patties to meet your needs. No matter where you are, Global is ready to serve you out of their manufacturing plants in Airdrie, Alberta, and in Butte, Montana, or from distribution depots across the continent. Visit them today at www.globalpatties.com.
That's right. We want to thank Bee Culture Magazine for continuing their presenting sponsorship of this podcast. Bee Culture has been a magazine for American beekeeping since 1873. Subscribe to Bee Culture today, and while you're there, check out Bee Culture's Beekeeping, Your First 3 Years, a quarterly magazine for beginning beekeepers. We also want to thank 2 Million Blossoms as sponsor this episode. 2 Million Blossoms is a new quarterly magazine dedicated to protecting all pollinator insects, both wild and managed, before they disappear. The magazine is full of beautiful photos and informative articles. Learn more on our Season 2, Episode 9 podcast with editor Kirsten Traynor and from visiting www.2millionblossoms.com, and that is with a number 2. You know, every week we thank our sponsors, and they are important to this show. Their continuing sponsorship allows us to keep this podcast going by paying the bills so we can bring you the great interviews as we have enjoyed in the past and those that are coming up. Please support our sponsors and let them know you are buying from them because of their support of this podcast. Hey everybody, thanks for joining us on our new podcast episode release day of Monday. We've switched to a Monday release because we want to help you ease into a new week by listening to your favorite beekeeping podcast. And today, we are continuing our special interviews co-hosted by 2 Million Blossoms editor Dr. Kirsten Traynor. Kirsten will be joining us today and in upcoming episodes. Welcome, Kirsten, or should I say, Guten Tag.
Guten Abend here. It's actually evening here. I have just arrived in Berlin, Germany, and so I am guest hosting from abroad.
Germany, Berlin, what are you doing there?
I am here for a summer postdoc with the Free University of Berlin, where I'm working in a robotics lab to help them track bees and develop a robot bee that can do a waggle dance that bees follow.
A waggle dance that bees can follow. I got to believe that you're also going to be working on it, having it pollinate too. Am I right?
That I wish. No, this will be in an observation hive only. But the goal is to get it to dance so that other bees will listen in and follow the instructions.
Wow.
So ideally we would be able to send them exactly where we want.
Isn't that interesting? I almost want to. I have visions of the Terminator and T2, but I just.
That would be funny. Half bee, half machine.
Yeah, I'll be back. All right, that's horrible. That's horrible. Oh, forgive me. That's bad.
We all love our bee puns.
Up to a certain point. Well, Kim, what have you been up to?
You know, it's been 70 degrees 2 days in a row. I think that's the first of spring. So I actually got outside and checked my hives today, and the worst one is doing better, and the best one is going gangbusters. So I'm happy.
Oh, good. Yes, it's spring here. In fact, if folks are following us on our new Instagram account, Beekeeping Today podcast on Instagram, you'll see that I woke up this morning, not woke up, but I went out this morning at 10:30 this morning, and the bees were greeting me with a nice swarm from the nuke that I got earlier this year. So lots of fun on those yards.
Did I hear that they found one of those hornets in your neighborhood?
Well, not in my neighborhood, thankfully. It's far north. It's up near the Canadian border. They did confirm a finding of an Asian giant hornet on someone's sidewalk. Someone stepped on it. So the next day, the Washington Department of Agriculture picked it up, and they confirmed that it was an Asian giant hornet. And they sent it off for DNA analysis, and that's the last update that they posted.
I hope they were wearing thick shoes.
I'm almost surprised they didn't trip over it.
Yeah. They are huge.
It was amazing. They had it, and we'll put the post in the show notes from the Washington Department of Agriculture. But they had it the hornet next to a quarter, and it looked like a dime. It was. I had to look at it and say, "Oh my gosh, that is a quarter." So
wow,
they are big.
Yeah, I've been getting lots of messages and emails from my non-beekeeping friends who wants to know if this is the murder hornet in their East Coast backyard.
Yeah, there's a lot of that going around. I think every beekeeper can probably relate. So today's interview, Dr. Meghan Milbrath. Who is she, Kirsten, and why did you want to interview her for the podcast?
Yes, so Meghan Milbrath runs her own beekeeping operation, Sand Hill Farms, and so she has reared nukes and raised queens for years, and she has supported herself full-time from her beekeeping operation. She now works for Michigan State University and coordinates a lot of their outreach and education as an extension officer. She really has done some fabulous work, especially in educating beekeepers about Varroa. But one of the reasons I wanted to talk with her is that her state grows a lot of the blueberries, and they've had a lot of issues with bee health while pollinating those fields, especially with European Foulbrood. And so she has actually gone out and surveyed colonies and measured the extent of EFB, and the numbers are just shockingly high. And so I really enjoy talking with her because she has both the practical hands-on beekeeping experience, but she brings to that a very scientific perspective from her own training in epidemiology.
A lot of what she also does is education. And
Yes.
you mentioned that, but she's got some very unique ideas on education that I found I've found to be really appealing. I've listened to her talk several times and been with her at meetings, so I'm looking forward to this.
I think you will enjoy it. She's always a wealth of information and has really good advice.
Well, let's get right into it.
Meghan, you've kept bees for a while. How did you first get into beekeeping?
I first got into beekeeping with my dad when I was a kid. So I grew up in northern Wisconsin, and my dad started keeping bees in the 50s as a 4-H project when he was a kid. And so we did it just at the hobby level at our house. So I think the most we ever had was it was 4 to 8 hives in the backyard.
Oh, fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then how did that grow into you run a full-scale bee business at the moment?
Yeah, so I've been doing it. So that was in the mid-90s. And then I have been doing it as a business since about 2011, I think, somewhere in there, which was growing during that time too. But that's when I started to try to make money off of it. And that really started at the end of my graduate school training. So when I was in grad school, I was keeping bees. So that was when I moved to Michigan, and I was keeping bees because I thought it would be a relaxing hobby. Yeah, I'm glad you laughed because people who aren't beekeepers are like, oh, that sounds nice. And but really what happened is that was coinciding. So I moved back to Michigan in around 2006. So that was right at the time that everything was happening.
Right.
So when I was keeping bees in the 90s, even though Varroa was technically in the United States, it really wasn't so widespread that it wasn't affecting us,
Right.
in rural northern Michigan. And so it just wasn't it was still in the fun era where you're oh, let's go catch these swarms, and we'll find the queen for fun, but not why is everything dying? And then when I moved to Michigan, I joined the local bee club, and it was just decidedly not fun. And people were panicking, and they were well, we really need, the answer is going to be we really need these northern queens. And so I was working. So I only had a couple hives because I was in grad school and I had no money. But I was helping another beekeeper who was a sideliner, and he had, usually 75 to 100 hives, and he was doing queen rearing. And so I was there's such a huge demand for queens. I'm going to start selling queens to people because that was like, everybody's like, oh, it's these weak Southern queens and this is the issue. And like, we need these resistant treatment-free Northern genetics. And I was like, I can raise queens. I'm going to do this. There's a huge demand. And so I started raising queens and selling nukes, just kind of super small. And then, because when I moved to Michigan, I just, I had some equipment and I just caught a swarm, and then I split that to 2, and then I split that to 4, and then I got up to 10. And so I was just kind of doing slow growth. And then when I got up to about 30, I started selling nukes. I had a similar trajectory in growth. You start with 3 and 3 becomes 6. And before you know it, you have 25, and you have to do something with all those offspring. I work with people that are like, oh, we only want no more than 4 in our backyard. And I'm like, you have such reasonable limits. So that's kind of where it grew the most. And then, so when I graduated from my PhD, I went directly into a postdoc. They actually kind of overlapped. Okay. And, but then the postdoc ran out of money. And so I just sold bees for 2 years in between while I was trying to find a second postdoc or a job. Okay. And so I did it. And so at that point, I was getting up to about 200 hives. That's quite a number to run. Yeah, but that was my job at that point. Right. So it's very different. Now when I'm actually working, it feels like a lot more. So to manage 200 well and keep your mites in check is definitely a full-time job, and you might need some assistance with it. I'm always amazed by the numbers people can run. So you currently work from Michigan State University as an academic specialist and extension agent on honeybee and pollinator health, but your scientific training was in disease transmission. How did your background give you unique insight that you use in your current work? Yeah, and it is I had no intention of studying honeybees. I really do love just straight up disease transmission and studying microbes and it's in risk assessment. And I love looking at environmental risk of pathogens. And so my PhD was in the environmental health health sciences department, but I was co-advised with epidemiology because I was part of an interdisciplinary program. Right. And it has been awesome for the bees because really those are fields that focus on really learning skills. So you learn the tools of how to do a proper risk assessment, and you learn how to model disease transmission, and you learn how to evaluate. So like when I was doing my PhD, I actually worked on, I think, 6 different projects, things looking at antibiotic resistance to norovirus or dengue virus, and like norovirus and combined sewer overflows. And then I went to dengue in, Ecuador. Like it allows you get the tools that you apply to systems. Right. Whereas like entomology is a field where you're more learning, like you like have the system first. Like you're like, okay, I'm going to study bugs. And so I know I'm actually very thankful for that background, because the things that are happening to bees are really similar, like poor nutrition, toxicological threats, and obviously diseases, and so I kind of have worked on building that way of, like now I can do risk assessments on fungicides, or I can, model dynamics for viruses. Right. Well, and I imagine, the way we move bees around the country is very similar as how humans move in many ways. And it's probably, can you talk a bit about how our industry makes control of certain issues difficult? Yeah, and actually, so I do a lot of work with veterinarians right now. So that's been a really natural fit for me, is to do continuing ed with veterinarians, and because they have to work with antibiotics. And one of the things that I've really tried to express to them is just how profoundly high the risk is for honeybee diseases. Like if we wanted to create an epidemic, do you know what we would do? Is we would take almost all the animals of the species in the country and put them under stress, put them in like one spot where they all do a ton of interaction, and then move them back around the country. Like that's literally how we would do it. And so pretty much just described almond pollination. Yeah, exactly. And that's just something that's also been really hard to get across to the veterinarians. It's like honeybees are different from other animals in that, there are people who keep them just for the joy of having an animal in their backyard, but we also, like most of them are kept so that we get to eat food. So
Right.
we're asking them to do stuff that we know isn't in the best interest of the bees all the time. I mean, sometimes it is, but like sometimes we're asking them to kind of like they're working and we need them to do that so we have food. And there's no like, you don't bring, cattle across country for pollination. Like every time, anything that you do with like another animal system, you're doing it because like it's what's going to benefit that animal or benefit like getting that animal to market or, getting a crop from that
Right.
animal in the case of dairy. But there's never like a, we're putting the bees under all this pressure that really does incredibly enhance the disease risk, in order so that we have something completely separate from bees, which I think is interesting.
I mean, in some sense, most animals that vets are probably encountering, they're either kept for pleasure or for food. They're not employed for work, whereas honeybees are like old work, the traditional workhorses.
Yeah.
But yes, I find it fascinating. And I would imagine having your perspective, it's very difficult at times to deal with some of the questions you get in because you're coming at it from a disease perspective and understanding spread, which must lead to some very interesting conversations with beekeepers who vary in their Varroa treatment habits, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and with the varying in the habits, I think my background in disease spread was actually, it helps me kind of come to terms with a lot of that variation in particular.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of it is like when I study dengue, that's a mosquito-borne illness. And when we talk about Varroa, it's a vector-borne disease because we're really talking about the viral damage as well. And the thing about vector-borne diseases is they're inherently highly variable because you have that extra component of the vector. So you have the disease, you have the host, and you have the vector in this context of the environment. And a lot of people, like the thing that is most difficult in Varroa education is people not realizing that the amount of work they have to do to manage Varroa is specific to them in particular and where their hives are at in particular and what the disease risk is in their area.
Right.
Like if I live in an area, like when I was growing up, there were no mites in that area. I didn't have to do a thing. And like now Southern Michigan is like, we won Mitathon last year, like not in the fun way.
Not in a good way.
Yeah. And like, it's really hard. Like I can't imagine a place in our state where you could set up bees and not be at risk.
Right.
And a lot of people read stuff, they view the way that they treat mites is not in response to what the actual disease risk is for their bees. Like you should be responding. You should have a response that is in line with what is actually happening in the hive. So if you have a lot of disease pressure or a lot of parasite pressure or a lot of risk, you need to have a stronger response in order to keep your bees healthy. Whereas people are like, well, so-and-so is treatment free, so I know it can be done.
Right. And they don't understand the impact of your own region and also the bees that move in and out of a territory.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. Exactly. So like if I was living like in Siberia, maybe not that far north, but like if I was living in some completely remote place, especially like if I was living where bees were in their native range in a completely remote place with no pesticide threat and tons of forage and no other beekeepers around, I would be great. I would just be fishing and drinking beer and getting honey, but like if I'm living in Michigan, which is one of the like beekeeping dense states with this huge epidemic of Varroa with, tons of pesticide issues, tons of nutritional land use changes issues, I'm going to have to do a lot more work because this is the place where I'm choosing to keep bees. And so I think that's one thing that's really hard to get across is like people take these like general beekeeping things and it is really so absolutely like specific to your particular area.
Yeah, I think, the old adage from real estate of location definitely applies to beekeeping. So Varroa is obviously a very difficult parasite. And what is your advice to beekeepers on managing this highly complex parasite?
Well, I used to say that everything will change once you take it seriously. And then someone corrected me and they said, everything changed once I took it critically. And I think the difference is that And sometimes it is something that you have to learn through experience. So I just talked to a beekeeper yesterday, and he's lost his bees the last 3 years, which is literally, unfortunately, normal. Is that people get into beekeeping, they really struggle a couple of years, and then they all of a sudden will start to take it seriously and really start learning about management and really starting, to learn about monitoring and to make sure that they keep it under control, and then everything changes.
Right.
It is sad that we have to do, that people go through those 3 years of death and really realize, okay, in my location, I just can't keep bees alive without doing anything extra. It's unfortunate, but I was trying to be much more compassionate in my old age and in this current climate. But I was trying to but now everybody wants, you don't want to do excess in your hives, but now, okay, we've done 3 years, let's not keep being the fly against the screen. We know that system doesn't work. You definitely know that you have to do something, really take it seriously, and that'll turn it around. So I would say that's the first message. The second message is that people really focus on knocking down the mites. And that's still really damaging to bees. If you let your animal get overloaded with parasites, and then you slowly get away of those parasites, if you start, treating with oxalic acid, that's not the same as keeping your animal healthy.
Right.
And one of the things that we know, especially with this particular disease complex, is that the deformed wing virus was naturally a virus that was transmitted from bee to bee. So once it's in the hive, the bees totally transmit it amongst themselves. So even if you get rid of the mites at that point, you're basically revenge killing the mites, but you're not actually keeping your bees healthy. So there's a difference between knocking down mites and keeping bees healthy. So if I go into it with the perspective of, I want my bees to be in good health, I want my animal never to be overcome with parasites, that's very different than I'm going to wait till they get high and only treat at the last minute if my animal is near death.
Well, and as you say, when you wait until late, often your colony health is so compromised that even without the Varroa, those nurse bees are not doing a great job of rearing the next generation. You have a very short window before the winter approaches, and it's those winter bees that you really need to be as healthy as possible.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we see. It's beekeepers will be the first year they're not going to treat, the second year maybe they're not going to treat. Then once they start losing bees, they're oh, we're going to treat. And then they'll treat, which is not the same as managing mites, and they'll put something in their hive, but they'll put it in the fall after the winter bees are formed. The die has already been cast for that colony. And then they're well, I treated and it didn't work. But there was no part of that where they're actually keeping those winter bees healthy, which is the ultimate goal.
Yeah, I always try to emphasize with people that it's really in the summer months, especially right around midsummer, that you need to know what your Varroa mite levels are, because you have that small window to get them down low enough so your bees can rear their winter bees in August and September. Obviously, that changes depending on where in the country you are and when your winter starts. We are starting to see signs of amitraz resistance in Varroa. When this miticide fails, what options do you think beekeepers will have to control their Varroa?
I've been talking to a lot of beekeepers. I mean, it is hard to know because they're really, I don't know if, I know that the USDA is screening a lot of things, and there are some big projects screening a lot of new things, but it takes a long time to get things in the pipeline or to get going.
Right.
A lot of the beekeepers I know that are really good beekeepers are managing a lot with physical methods. So taking advantage of the part that bees do naturally reset a lot. So working with splits and breaks in the brood cycle and requeening or shaking packages, and really working with breaks in the brood cycle. And then even a lot of people are working with breaking the brood cycle with controlled indoor storage.
Okay.
And so I think, and that's one thing, is to make sure that we're focusing more on not necessarily, not always being focused on knocking back, but being focused on, we know a lot about Varroa natural dynamics. And so how do we just keep interrupting their reproduction so that we can keep them at low levels?
Right.
So I think there's a lot of hope hope there of looking at, and again, that's going to be something that's super specific because you're going to have to time it around your honey flows and whether or not you need to build for pollination contract. If you need to build for almonds, it's going to be a totally different time than
management cycle.
Yeah. So like, I think that's something that each beekeeper is going to have to figure out how, like the actual details of how it looks. Mm-hmm. But I think there's just a lot of potential of, inducing a late summer brood break or, getting rid of the brood at this time of year or using queen cells instead of mating queens to requeen it, when you could have a little slower build up.
Right. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by winter storage? I'm sure not all our listeners are familiar with it.
Yeah, and this is something that I don't personally do because I don't have any money to build a facility, but this is something that I'm really, really interested in, and a lot of beekeepers in my area are interested in. And they just released a really nice guidance document about kind of the details of doing indoor storage. But it is actually something that is really old. Like I was just reading an article from like the 1850s that does
potato storage sheds.
Yeah, and even in basements, or people would build bee barns, and then in China they would just bury them in the ground in some places.
Wow.
So the idea is to put the bees. So bees are very, very metabolically efficient, right around 40 to 45 degrees. Mm-hmm. And they kind of, shut down and lose way less energy, but that's also, and they, stop raising brood. And
which allows then Varroa to all be phoretic and give an opportunity to get rid of.
Yeah, exactly. So you can get rid of a bunch of them. You can combine it. So part of it is just using temperature. And you do have to have a lot of ventilation. So it's not as easy. So a lot of people think like, I'm going to put it in my garage. But your garage is still getting, especially like people have attached garages, and it can actually get way too warm. Like you really want them to be at a consistent temperature. So they are just very calm, and it's basically putting them in the situation where their bodies need to use the least amount of energy. Mm-hmm. But they are still metabolizing. So you do have to have a lot of airflow to get rid of the carbon dioxide. Okay. But there's a lot of looking at whether or not you can combine this broodless period that you're inducing through temperature with with like oxalic acid, or with even increasing carbon dioxide might make an effect. So, out west, they're looking a lot at what the carbon dioxide levels would be. It's kind of hard to treat en masse because a lot of the ones we use, like for example, formic acid, like you can't just put formic acid in the building because you would basically it just wouldn't work. And there's things that you couldn't do safely, but I think there's a lot of potential there, and even just the brood break makes a big difference too.
Right. And apparently when the bees come out of these storage sheds, because it hasn't been a true cold winter, it's just at that, as you say, ideal temperature where they're metabolically efficient, they come out with raring to go and ready to start rearing brood quite quickly.
Yeah, and they say like a lot of it, I listened to a panel on this recently, and the big message, and again, like this is me telling you what other people have told me and what I've read, but I have experimented with sticking with bees in my basement, but that's more like a comedy show than actual beekeeping advice. But the panel that I listened to had really good advice about the fact that your bees don't get better. Right. They do still get worse when they're in these sheds, but it is a slower, less dramatic worse. And if you think about it, like the way that we treat, because I have raised other livestock as well. And like the way that we treat other animals in wintertime, like there's very few animals that we're like, nah, we're not changing your housing at all. Like you'll be fine out in that field, and like, it does make sense. And I don't actually want to go down the road of insulating and wrapping, but like, it does definitely make sense to put an animal in a situation, like they can't get food from the environment. Right. There's not a huge value of leaving them out in the conditions if they're going to experience these huge dramatic swings and these really stressful colds. And then this, if you can keep them in a more moderate temperature, like that physiologically, that's much less stress on them.
Right. And even the extreme colds, they seem to do all right with. It's when you have extreme colds and then warm and then cold again, which we seem to be seeing a lot more of in our Januaries and Februaries, is these fluctuating temperatures. that I always feel sort of confuse the brood rearing pattern of the bees.
Yeah, and I think that too is a lot where some of the nuances of different genetics make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
In my area, people always, they're like, oh, I want those tough northern genetics. And I'm always like, what do you think that looks like on the bee? Like, do you think they have little vests? Do they have like more fur? Like, what makes a bee like a northern bee? And I think what is really happening is not so much that they're like tougher, is more that they're kind of timed more, like it would make sense that an Italian bee would start building up in February because
Right.
they've evolved for, however long in an area where things were blooming in February. Like, we don't have anything that's blooming in February where I live. I guess maybe a witch hazel. But like there's there's really not food at that time. So they're not necessarily timed in response to maybe what would be optimal in my area. So I think that's where some nuances of like little breeding programs, or at least doing stock selection, can make a difference, is finding the ones that are like, okay, these, after time, your best bees are going to be the ones that are going to be the ones who are responding the best in your environment. So you can kind of be like, oh, these, because you do notice a lot, like there's definitely an age difference of who, raises bees late into the season, but then also starting up early, and there's nutritional limitations and things like that. But there's definitely genetic variation too.
Yeah, and I think the idea that one bee is perfect for all branches of the beekeeping industry is probably quite misleading. I mean, commercial people who are pollinating in February, they definitely do need bees that boom early, whereas your backyard beekeepers in upstate Michigan or Vermont, they really don't want a colony that starts expanding until weathers are consistently warmer and there's forage available.
And even in the same location, like two different, like maybe someone wants to run 2 queen systems and someone else wants to do a single deep brood nest and someone else wants to split in the fall, and then or maybe someone else is right next to a bunch of basswood and they want to time it for that flow. Like, I think it does. That's why I really promote stocks. Like I really like the breeding programs for things like hygienic behavior and getting more like these particular traits that I think are really useful in high grooming. But I really think there's a lot of value in hobbyists and sideliners are pretty notoriously bad or neglectful of doing good stock selection.
Right.
So saying like, okay, I'm not going to just buy queens from so-and-so because I like him, but I'm actually going to look at the bees that I have. And, and like these 3 colonies really outperformed and they kept their mite levels down. Like, I'm going to raise queens off of the ones that are thriving in my area under my particular form of management. You would, like every other animal, like if you have a flock of sheep, you would do this. Like, it's not like you don't let every animal, or they'll just like let everything requeen on its own, regardless of if you got no honey off of it or, 3 boxes of honey.
Right.
Like,
or you've been nursing it along the entire time.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah,
I think part of that is a holdover. I know when I started out in beekeeping in the early 2000s and I expressed interest in rearing queens, I was told, oh, we don't rear queens, we buy queens. There's no way you could ever rear your queens. And I'm really glad to see that there has been a shift and many more people are interested in rearing their own queens. I think I fully concur. Local selection amongst your own colonies, even if you're only running 5, usually you have 1 or 2 that do much better than the other 3. And so you might as well make your splits from those and let them rear their own queens if you're not grafting, or learn to graft and make queens.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I do. Actually, last night, I taught a class online about non-grafting queen rearing for people who just want a couple. Like, it's totally, and my major message was that it's not hard and everybody should try it. Like, there's really not, and it's also not expensive. You can do it.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. I agree. I fully concur. People should try, and you'll take so much pride in that first queen you rear, right?
Oh my gosh. And then you'll be so less stressed. Like, you lose a queen, you're like, well, that's too bad, but I've got, a whole
2 more in reserve,
couple more in reserve. Like, all of a sudden, it's just not that big of a deal. Yeah. Like if that colony doesn't raise up a queen, like whatever, I have this nuke on hand. It's just, it allows you to be so much more sustainable and independent.
I think that's a very key point is a growing sustainability in our own apiaries. And like you say, having a nuke on hand, there's so many problems you can fix if you have a nuke on hand. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you have 3 hives and something goes wrong, then you're struggling, you're calling everybody up, you're paying high shipping fees to get in a queen immediately. That sustainability in our own apiaries is definitely something worth pursuing.
Better Bee is pleased to present the interviews by Kirsten Traynor. As a supplier to our nation's beekeepers for over 40 years, Better Bee provides the tools, equipment, and information you need to succeed. Through its many beekeeping employees, Better Bee serves you with solutions to your beekeeping challenges. That's why they can say with confidence that they are your partners in better beekeeping. Thanks to Better Bee for their informative catalog, website, supportive beekeeper education, and for sponsoring the series featuring Kirsten. Be sure to see the latest at betterbee.com.
Something that I've learned more from working with the veterinarians too, and again, like going back to looking at everything through a lens of diseases, is just how bad beekeepers are with biosecurity. Okay. And so like when I just went and worked with another extension group with a bunch of veterinarians, and we disinfected the tires on our vehicles before we drove to another farm, because you can definitely be bringing in fungal diseases, and we wore booties over our shoes. And, that was a little dramatic because I was working with extension in the state, and, you want to definitely demonstrate that it was not from me, but right. Like a lot of beekeepers, like all of people show up at my house to volunteer with their dirty leather gloves and their dirty hive tool.
Yeah.
And a veterinarian once told me like a hive tool is like kind of the equivalency of a surgical instrument. Mm-hmm. And like you would be so grossed out if someone, you like did surgery on an animal and then like didn't even wash it and use it on another animal. And that's at least from yard to yard, that's like effectively what we're doing. And a lot of people, it doesn't even come up on their radar to, like the sooner you can close your apiary without like constantly importing from other people, like queens are pretty low risk. You'll be hard pressed to get me to say not to try out other people's fancy queens.
Yeah.
But like brood frames and packages, and like, if you can just close the doors, like A, financially, and B, environmentally sustainable, but C, just in terms of you're just not importing those diseases. And it's not to say like package producers and nuke producers by definition have to be good at controlling diseases. Otherwise they literally wouldn't have
go
bees
out of business.
Yeah. But it's just that bees aren't sterile, and they could be healthy in those hives. But once they go through a package is a bizarro situation for a bee. Like that's a super high stress situation. And it could be that, things get triggered or they're in a different area, or, there's all sorts of stuff that can happen. So that was when I started working with the veterinarians, and they were so focused on biosecurity, and they were asking about normal practices. And I don't mean to say like beekeepers are bad, but like it was when I was reflecting on, I didn't like the way that I worded that. But when I was was reflecting with these veterinarians on what some standard practices were, it definitely made it really visible that it's not on the radar for a lot of beekeepers. And like, this is at all different scales too. Like there's definitely some people who are really good about it and like wash hive tools and don't use leather gloves and like are washing their hands and have, sanitizer out in the yard, and who are really careful about like transmitting stuff from yard to yard. And then, or they'll have at least their own operation is closed, and then there's other people that are just like, hey, do you have a frame of brood I can have? Like I've got this hive that I'm trying to get to requeen.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, and it varies. I think it also varies by culture. I know I can't remember if it was Switzerland or Sweden. There was definitely one European country where every colony has its own hive tool underneath the inner cover, and you don't use one hive tool from hive to hive, which seems a little on the extreme side. But from a biosecurity standpoint, you could see where they're going with it. I think their idea was they were very concerned about American Foulbrood, and so they kept colonies as units, whereas I think most beekeepers tend to treat apiaries as units.
I think for me that the apiary as a unit makes the most sense. Like, especially if you look at the European Foulbrood research, like those girls just drift. Like they're definitely in a lot of hives. At least the nurse or the worker bees are definitely flying from hive to hive.
About European Foulbrood, Michigan grows a lot of specialty crops, including blueberries, where European Foulbrood seems to be a big issue. Beekeepers often complain of colony health issues. Can you tell us more about European Foulbrood and specialty crops?
Yeah, so there definitely is this association between European Foulbrood showing up right after blueberry bloom. So there's a thesis by Gordy Wardell from Michigan State University in 1983 talking about, sorry to age you, Gordy, talking about European Foulbrood coming off of blueberry bloom. So like it's definitely not a new thing at all. Mm-hmm. And then also when we were at Apimondia, we scheduled a special evening session for beekeepers and researchers who state apiarists and stuff who've been working on this issue. And there were people from Quebec and British Columbia and Oregon and New Jersey, all the places. And so it is hard though, because like I said, like it's an association. The things that we're looking at are fungicides, nutrition, hive dynamics in response to the movements and the nectar flow, because all of those areas are super diverse. So like, for example, in Michigan, we're just about to put out a paper showing the different plants that bees are collecting during blueberry bloom in Michigan while they're on pollination contracts. And it's a lot, and so and it's not the same plants that are in Maine blueberries, so there's definitely something there that's been there for a long time. One of the things that has changed though recently is there's always been this story about EFB that, you get it a little bit in the springtime, but then you put them on a good nectar flow and it'll just clean right up. Mm-hmm. And I have been seeing in our research, we do some things that follow commercial hives all the way into the fall, and you're seeing EFB all the way into the fall. And we're seeing devastating EFB. So we're seeing really high levels. We're seeing really high rates. So lots of colonies infected. We're seeing colonies that are infected having really severe disease. And then we're seeing that disease lingering. If it's not treated, we're seeing it linger like all the way through the summer. So it's not spontaneously resolving. So it does seem to be a little different. And then a lot of beekeepers are saying that it looks a little different too. Because it has, we always think about EFB having the corkscrew shape, the visible trachea. We'll see ones that are just kind of this generalized melty, which has a lot of like really bad, gross names, because it is a really gross looking frame. But you'll see just kind of these non-specific looking white melty, and they turn kind of gummy, and like it's. Is
that from secondary bacteria moving in, or
likely? And that's what I think, and that's what a lot of people think too. But we do have. So I'm working on a project with the USDA looking at all the different bacterial friends that are present. Because the thing with American Foulbrood is it is just the bacteria that causes American Foulbrood, but in European Foulbrood, it's the bacteria that causes European Foulbrood plus all of her friends, and she's kind of she's like the good friend that she starts it and then she leaves the party early. And so a lot of times she'll kind of start the infection in a particular larva, but then a lot of times other things finish it out. Yeah. And sometimes you can't find her because other things are there. And so it makes it really difficult to study. The other thing that makes it really difficult to study is there's a lot of inapparent infection. Mm-hmm. So you can find bees with Melissococcus plutonus in them in hives with no disease. Okay. So we have infection with no disease. So you have bees that have the etiological agent, but there's the brood all looks fine. And so that makes it really hard to study. So it seems to be something that's kind of maybe, I don't know. We don't know what's the thing that makes it kind of
So
turn.
maybe there are other risk factors involved that actually cause the visible symptoms. A little bit like COVID.
Yeah, I mean, it is funny because like my natural language is to use all these epidemiology terms, and people finally understand them now. So like that is, I mean, there are many, many sad things, but a little silver lining for me is like people care about epidemiology in this moment.
Oh yes, very much so.
It's made it easier to talk.
When you say you have high infection rates, what percentage of colonies in blueberries are coming down with EFB symptoms?
So we did 2 years, because that was one of the hard parts, is that we just had a lot of beekeeper anecdotal evidence of this association, but there's some stuff published, but not a ton. And and it was hard for us to get money because, I want to write a grant saying it is a problem. Beekeepers say there's lots. So we just
lots is not very quantifiable.
So we just did like a really basic cohort study of just following healthy hives. And for 2018 and 2019, we looked at colonies that were coming into blueberries. We looked at them basically the day they were brought in sight. And we only selected colonies, and these studies were pretty large. Like we had, I think, like 120 colonies each year or somewhere on that scale. And they were all, on average, they had about 15 frames of bees, like cluster size. And that's like a daytime cluster count. So they're big colonies.
Right.
And we looked at every frame of brood, and they had no size. Everybody was queen right. Everybody had basically zero Varroa. They were big colonies. Like they looked awesome. And we looked at every frame of brood, and we're not able to find any visible sign of disease. Like every third to fifth instar larva got eyes on it. So these were beautiful colonies. In 2018, we had about 26% get infected.
Okay.
And then in 2019, it was over 50%.
Wow, that's crazy. So you go in with healthy, wonderful looking colonies, and half of them probably when you pull them out are not even able to be saved.
And that's I think that's this was having moderate to severe. So this is greater than, I think we said, and the paper's not out, so I can't even direct you to that yet, but it was more than 10 visible larvae. And these were all confirmed to have EFB by Sam at the USDA Beltsville lab. And they didn't all die. And they did have different outcomes too, which is another thing that we're looking at. Sure. But I mean, they definitely were diseased. And some of them were horrible and did dwindle and die. And then some of them maybe technically didn't die, but usually what our beekeepers do in Michigan is they go to honey right after. And they just, you're not making a honey crop. So the economic cost of this disease is quite severe. And these are the part for me that was so striking is these were really good beekeepers, and they were really good looking hives, So like a lot of times we like to be like, well, they're stressing them out, like blah, blah, blah. But like these were good beekeepers. Varroa was really malmanaged. There was a good food source on, yet we're seeing these just devastating rates of disease.
Yeah, no, that has to be very frustrating, especially since for a pollination contract, blueberries doesn't even pay that much. And then if you lose the health of your colony and then your follow-up honey production, that's a big expense for beekeepers to pocket.
Yeah, and it is something. So I was on a call with our fruit team yesterday or the day before, and they've talked about some of the growers are struggling to find beekeepers that are still willing to do some of these contracts.
Right.
And are just kind of choosing not to do it. And so I think it's at a time that there's so little known, and it seems to be getting worse so quickly that people haven't really adjusted, or they don't know what to do or how to move forward out of it. But it's definitely getting to the point where it is having economic impacts as well.
Sure. I mean, growers need the pollination, and if beekeepers are not willing to provide, then usually costs of pollination go up, and eventually somebody's either willing to sacrifice their bees for the value they're getting, but it's difficult circumstances for sure. So you also do a lot of outreach and teaching. What kind of struggles are you finding that backyard beekeepers are facing?
Yeah, so my position covers like I said, like I do a lot of work with commercial beekeepers, but it really covers everybody. So I could say backyard beekeepers, I would say all the things. I mean, definitely Varroa. We just have not won the educational campaign and giving it the respect it deserves. And there's a lot of people, I think that the biggest frustration for me is the people who are starting and they're getting information that basically sets them up for failure.
Okay.
You know, so they're thinking that you can just set out a hive and just kind of let it grow, or not getting, you know, sufficient hives. So I think one of the things is trying to sort through, like, as there's so much more beekeeping advice on the internet, and just trying to make sure that people are able to figure out what is relevant for them and what is actually useful. And so we actually are working on an online course right now, and is very far off. But the unit we were working on, like literally the call before this one, was on critically evaluating beekeeping resources. So part of our beekeeping course right now has to be on how to evaluate other beekeeping stuff, because there's so much out there that's not putting people in a direction that'll let them be successful with beekeeping.
Right.
So it's just like this huge deluge of information that you have to sort through, and you can't tell what's really relevant. And I'm really lucky because I was raised in the situation where you, like, you know, you learn with somebody, you learn their system, and then you
adapt it.
Yeah. And then you get bees from that. So just like I learned with my dad, and then I got bees. And then, like, when I moved to Michigan, I worked with somebody else, and I got bees from him, and I used his system, and then I kind of adapted his system. And like, that is definitely the ideal way to learn. But, you know, we just don't have, we're in this pyramid where we have like a few people who really have a lot of experience that have the capacity to be mentors, and then about like 9 million new people. You know, so we have to kind of catch up of making sure that those 9 million new people get served with a good system, but we're kind of like trying to create the good system.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's very difficult, and there are definitely some online influencers whose information may not be appropriate if you're just starting out with bees. It's hard to communicate that you may want to try the traditional approach to begin with, and once you have that functioning for you, then branch off and try new things.
Yeah. And that's been our really big message, is just like find someone whose bees are alive in your area, because that's another thing too, is a lot of people are posting stuff, and like they're posting stuff before they really have found success. Yeah. And so like find someone in your area whose bees are alive, and just really try to follow that. And then you can totally move. Like, I have had bees in all, like I've tried Varroa hives and Langstroth hives, and, you know, like, I mean, everything that I do for my business is in Langstroth, but I'll try other stuff so I can have experience with it. And like, you can choose and always swap out at any time, but like, you might as well find a good system that you know works to modify. The other thing that we're teaching, which I really wish that more people would teach, is that year one, you just purchase a veil. And you don't get bees until you like have worked with bees for a summer.
Okay. So volunteering with other people, and
just go out and like figure out and like actually get hive time, you know, because like your very first inspection, let's say you install a package and you have to find eggs. If that's going to be the first time you see eggs, like that's kind of a high risk time to spend 40 minutes in the hive trying to figure out what an egg looks like.
This is definitely true. And if you're volunteering in somebody else's colonies, they can help point out the relevant information. Yeah,
it is definitely like there's no substitute for hive time and like working with experienced people, and like, and we've actually had to write articles though on like how to not be a jerk when you're volunteering too, because that's another like people. There's a lot of people who are like, well, you know, people are like, well, I can't find anyone who will come out and help me with my bees. And I'm like, well,
no, you have to go to somebody. This is the whole point of volunteering. So do you actually at MSU offer apiary days where people can come and learn with an experienced beekeeper? I know some universities are doing that these days.
We are starting. So MSU is kind of slowly building a team of people. We're definitely capacity limited at this moment.
Sure.
What we've done, though, is started to work with, so we have the Sentinel Apiary program through the Bee Informed Partnership, and we have usually about 6 different locations throughout the state. And we've tried different models. We've been doing this for, I don't know, maybe 4 years. And we have different models, but some of them we actually partner with a local bee club.
Nice.
And then when we come out to take care of them, and so like obviously that doesn't fit the whole needs of the state. We also use those hives for teaching our Heroes to Hives program, which is our bee veteran program, which Adam and Grayo runs. And then the goal for this summer was to also do continuing education classes for veterinarians too. We do a veterinary rotation with those, but to have it open to more public. So it's definitely something that like we know the demand is there.
It's a question of time and resources.
Yeah, it's a question of time and resources. And like I would love, like we could, it is really interesting, like going back to other livestock, like a lot of other animal systems will have, you know, there's a small ruminant extension educator in my county. You know, like we don't have any extension educators at the moment for honeybees. Like hopefully that will change very soon. That's one of the things we're working on. But like, we just don't, for some reason, they really slipped out of getting the same amount of support that we give to other livestock. And so that is something that like MSU's definitely, they have heard that message come from me lots. And they're definitely like, we're definitely working on it. But I think that is a big problem, is just making sure that we have lots of stuff out there for people.
Sure. And I mean, you have a very diverse workload. Your work also at times extends beyond honeybees. What other cool pollinators have you worked with in Michigan?
Yeah, so I work very closely with Rufus Isaac's lab, who does a lot of more diverse pollination. So he's a small fruit crop entomologist, and part of what he does is a lot of work. He's had a lot of students work on native bee projects. So I would say it's more through my extension side. So we have a website, pollinators.msu.edu, and we've really built that up a ton with resources for planting and getting to know the native bees, and really like very practical resources with planting. So we try to have a spreadsheet of, here are people we know that you can hire to consult for you, you know, like, and really,
excellent.
Try to actually address, you know, what are the actual obstacles when someone says they want to put in pollinator habitat, but they don't, like, where do they get stopped, you know, and try to figure out things that will actually address those little small. And that was one of them, is like, they can't find someone who will spray. You know, and so trying to figure out how to address those. The other thing that we did on that site that I'm really proud of is we have the Pollinator Champions course. And so, and again, that came out of a capacity thing, is I'd get asked to give talks, like I could give a talk like every day of the week on pollinators, you know, and like, I'm sure you get asked about that too. And like that I could go to a nursing home or a library or a school or a nature center and talk about what's happening with the pollinators. And so what we did is we developed this course. It's free, and it's designed to be like about 5 hours, and it answers the questions. It's a little Michigan specific, but a lot of it is pretty broad. And it answers the questions: why do we care about pollinators? So like the importance of pollination, who are the pollinators in Michigan, what is happening to pollinators, and what you can do to help. And
excellent.
Then and it really, we did put a lot of time into it. And then at the end, people can, like, if they want to just stop there, that's great. If they want to pay a small fee, they can get a little certificate, but they can also get a PowerPoint, and then they can go give a talk. And the PowerPoint is like super heavily annotated, so that someone could go give a talk to a nature center on, you know, what is happening to pollinators and who are the pollinators and what can we do to help. Because that is, we get asked to do that a lot, but like, beekeepers can totally do that. Master gardeners have been awesome partners for that. There's a lot of people that can deliver that level of education to their community. It doesn't have to be me. And so that one has been something that's been really great for us.
That's excellent. And that, again, is available online, you said?
Yeah, if you, it's pollinators.msu.edu, or it should be the first thing that comes up if it's Pollinator Champions.
Pollinator Champion, great name. So, well, we really appreciate you having a chance to sit down and chat with us, and appreciate all the information you've shared. You're a wonderful resource for Michigan and well beyond as well. Thank you for all that you've done for beekeeping education, which is not always easy.
Well, thank you for those kind words and for having me. It is really nice to talk with you.
Well, enjoy your week. Good luck with the season, and I hope things return to normal before too long.
Me too. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, that was really good. Thank you, Kirsten.
My pleasure. I always enjoy talking with Meghan. She's a total blast to hang out with.
Wow. Yeah, it definitely seemed like it.
You know, the part that I liked, and it goes back to sort of the Russian bee thing we were talking about a while ago, Jeff. The ultimate choice for the best bee was the one that made the most honey. And Meghan was leading in the same direction when she said, if you want to learn to be a good beekeeper, work with a good beekeeper who's still in business. Because if they're doing what they're doing right because they're still in business. I couldn't sum up a better teaching method than work with somebody that's making money.
I fully concur. That's how I got my start. When I was first starting out with bees, I shadowed two brothers who were third-generation beekeepers. They only ran 20 colonies themselves, but they made over 150 nukes off of them. And just having that opportunity of opening their hives up, spotting multiple queens, making nukes again and again and again, and that repetitive process was eye-opening and has taught me so much.
Yeah, there was a lot of good information that Meghan had here today, but my takeaway is going to be, because I don't pollinate blueberries, but my takeaway is going to be a better way to teach. I think I'm going to take it and run, Meghan.
All right. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode of Beekeeping Today podcast. Before we go, I want to encourage our listeners to rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, wherever you download and stream the show. Your vote helps other beekeepers find us quicker. As always, we thank Bee Culture, the magazine for American beekeeping, for their sponsorship of Beekeeping Today podcast. We also want to thank our regular episode sponsor, Global Patties. Check them out at www.globalpatties.com. And finally, we want to thank you, the Beekeeping Today podcast listener, for joining us on this show. Feel free to send us questions and comments at questions@beekeepingtodaypodcast.com. We'd love to hear from you. Hey, Kim, Kirsten, anything else you want to mention?
Just keep on listening and keep on enjoying the bees.
All right. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.